Co-opting innocence is the undisputed best part of my job. Excellent. All right, well, thank you for coming and talking about ethics with me, which is my favorite subject and hopefully one of yours. So here's the hope for this talk. I'm going to talk about some broad level topics, and I'm also going to talk about some practical approaches to some of these challenges. But ultimately, what I'm hoping for is to start a dialogue. So if you have questions or thoughts, hopefully we'll have time for Q&A, but if not, I will let you know where to find me. So let this be the beginning of thinking about how these topics apply to your particular work, and we'll go from there. So let's start about the undisputed good. So here are some of the things that mHealth apps allow us to do. Some of the things that really have been enormous game changers when it comes to altering the relationship between researcher and subject and clinician and patient. So first we have, of course, communication, and mostly HIPAA compliant, between clinician and patients. But we also have technology that can untether clinicians from both desktops and exam rooms. All of a sudden, the delivery of care and what that looks like has changed from a traditional model where you and I are sitting in a small cramped room. And now we're moving to something far more interesting and far more dynamic. And that also can happen in real time. So when we talk about what's possible, we're talking about an alteration in the relationship between patient and clinician, and also between researcher and subject. We also have a whole bunch of improvements in the ease of delivery of care or research. So charting is easier, delivery of care is easier, portability, all of that makes life easier for everyone. But we also have a number of other advantages. So what you're actually looking at right now is a smart sensor pacemaker. So included in this pacemaker, of course, is the traditional purpose of a pacemaker, which is to restore the rhythm of the heart if there's abnormalities. But we also have an enormous amount of data being collected on how the cardiac performance of this patient is actually going. All of this data can be submitted wirelessly to a cloud to a clinician in real time. So without invasive labs, now we have data being collected as the patient goes about their daily life. So here's what this gets us. So in addition to all sorts of interesting potential for uses, which we're going to talk about, we also have continuous monitoring. Instead of this old model of spot checking, right? And just trying to collect data in small bits whenever we can. So we have a much richer collection of data to work with. But we also have an increase in patient compliance by removing the need for patient care visits, right? So when the actual burden on patients or subjects is lowered, we actually get an increase in participation, both the number of people who want to participate and in the number of times they're willing to participate. This allows us to serve more people with fewer work hours, which is amazing when we talk about limited amounts of care and medical resources, especially when we talk about resource poor areas. And of course, we can do all of this as need arises. So we don't have to cross our fingers and hope we get lucky that we discover some sort of problematic or interesting event. Instead, we get to see when it happens, where it happens. So there are a few other advantages that we should talk about before we get to the challenges. So all of this sensor data, all of mHealth, all of this kind of collection allows patients to be more involved in their own care. So this alters now, again, the relationship and the dynamic between researcher and subject or clinician and patient, because all of a sudden we have someone playing an active role in whatever it is that they're being part of instead of just being passively observed. And that can be something extraordinarily powerful. This also creates tools to affect all sorts of lifestyle changes. So when we saw how many people use fitness trackers, about 4/5 of the room raised their hand. So no one uses fitness trackers just for funsies. You do it because you're trying to track improvement in fitness, right? You're trying to track so that you can actually make certain sorts of changes. So too with all sorts of other interventions. When we talk about the way that we can incorporate mobile health benefits to the patient or subject, this also allows them to enact all sorts of interesting improvements in their behavior. So there's been a lot of data with ways to improve your behavior, improve changes, make changes that you want. One of the most effective ways that all professors know about is when you believe that your behavior is being tracked, you are far more likely to stick with the behavior that you so desire. So there's a hilarious experiment that goes around all university professors where if you have students sign an honor code before an exam, instances of cheating go down, even if the university has no such honor code. It's the idea of thinking about someone monitoring you, someone thinking about your behavior influences how your behavior plays out. And of course, vulnerabilities in research and in clinical care. Well, we all know how inaccurate self-reporting is. Many of us can't remember what we had for breakfast this morning, much less last Tuesday. So when we ask you to self-report behavior, often what we get is something cloudy at best. But we also have cases, especially around sensitive data, where we have an enormous amount of deception, intentionally or not. So when I ask smokers how often they smoke, often that number is dramatically underreported. Now, is it intentional deception? Is it deception to self? Hard to say. But the data is certainly not accurate. So monitors allow me to get true data, accurate data, so that I can actually make the important kinds of conclusions that I'm going for. So that's the good. Let's talk about the rough spots. So I want to start by talking about some of the larger themes, things that emerge when we talk about mobile health that are sort of hotspots for us to be aware of. So again, my hope is that you think about how this applies to your particular projects and think about where the vulnerabilities in your work lie. So the first question has to do with data access. Now, one of the things that those of us who work in this area have found is that we're very, very young working on the ethics of mobile health, and that's because all of this capacity is extraordinarily new, especially for people like me who are philosophers who are like, remember when Aristotle said, right, so this is very new. So one of the things that we do is we look to see what are the front runners, what are the precursors to the current technologies, and start to see what kinds of problems emerge. When it comes to behavior sensors and data, one of the first trackers, one of the things that we start to see behavior tracking is actually in sleep quality with patients with sleep apnea. So patients with sleep apnea are often prescribed devices that are continuous air pressure machines, CPAPs, APAPs, BiPAPs. And here's what these machines do. So the machines, of course, help improve the quality of sleep of the patient by making sure that the airway stays open. But the machines do far more than that. They also track how many instances of apnea that a patient actually experiences through the night. They track how many hours the patient sleeps and is wearing the device. And they can also track all sorts of other sleep-related behavior. So here's what has happened with that data historically over the last 10 and 15 years. That data is generally stored on each machine via SD card or wireless modem, and then that data is transferred directly to either the manufacturer of the machine and or their cloud service, or the clinician directly. Sometimes there's a middleman, sometimes there's not. The clinician then makes evaluations and recommendations based on that data. Here's who is not in that data chain: the patient. So these machines have always been designed such that the data is opaque to the patient, him or herself. So here's what happened. There's an enormous amount of uproar. And if you search online, you will find many tutorials from patients written on how to hack their machines so that they get access to their own data. So one of the challenges that we have when we talk about mHealth is who exactly is going to be able to see the raw data. And one of the primary questions is, are the people involved going to be allowed to see it? And you might think, what's at stake when we ask that question? Well, here's the hard part. So when we have huge amounts of raw data, one of the reasons that sleep researchers originally didn't allow access to this data for patients You have raw data that's in no way interpreted. So now what you have is the danger of patients seeing huge amounts of data with nobody to walk them through it. Now, of course, what that means is that people worry, and often people worry without good cause. So the amount of resources and time it would take to walk each patient through each hour of sleep data becomes extraordinarily over-demanding. So one of the questions that you have to ask yourself is, do I allow patients to access their raw data? Now you might think, ooh, that seems like a downside. But then again, of course, who does the data belong to? We'll get there in a minute. But there is another question about data access that all of us who follow mHealth often worry about. So enter the San Bernardino shootings. So one of the emerging themes with the San Bernardino shootings that's relevant for all of us are questions of, does the government have a legitimate right and or access to the data that you are collecting? Whenever we talk about mHealth, we just heard a really powerful and slightly terrifying, depending on your perspective, talk about the quality and type of data that's being collected about us if we use this kind of device. So that can be used for a number of things, but at the very least, it can be used for all kinds of law enforcement or political purposes. What that means is that for the first time, those of us who do either research in this area or work with this technology as clinicians now have to think about our relationship not just with our patients and subjects, but also with the state. I will tell you now, it's best to think about that relationship up front, in advance, and not afterwards when something might happen. So thinking about these issues in advance, it will help. But now we have questions of who data does belong to. So when we think about the ability to track, what we're doing is we're actually tracking something that someone else is intentionally or unintentionally doing. The product that gets created, this data, is actually a joint product, right? So we may be creating the environment or technology that allows that behavior to be tracked, but it's the person or agent who's performing the behavior. What that means is we've created a joint product. Now, we all know how fun it is to think about joint ownership. If you've ever entered into business or worked on patents in any sort of joint way, you know that this is an extraordinarily delicate relationship. Here's what's going to help. If this isn't defined, this provides an enormous vulnerability for legal challenges and also ethical challenges later on, especially if anything is developed using this data. So one of the cases I teach freshmen about, is the case of Henrietta Lacks. I teach stem cell biology as part of my classes, and we talk about the history of cell biology. Henrietta Lacks, of course, is a woman who had cells taken without her consent, both cancerous and non-cancerous cells, and she is by far the godmother of current cell biology because her cells had a distinctive feature. They could be cultured. They didn't die. And what that means is today, undergraduates still work on HeLa cells, cells that are from this woman decades ago that were taken. Patents, products, developments, billions of dollars have been involved in the buying and selling of research on this cell line. She saw none of that. Neither did her family. The question of what is ethically appropriate when we think about what to do with this data and who owns it is something that we need to think about before and not after. We also have questions of accountability. So traditionally, when we talk about medical data, we talk about things like medical records. Medical records are fairly straightforward, right? They're written down, and in a way, they serve as a transcript of the kind of care and labs that patients receive. Most hospitals or institutions have ways that you can petition for that data to be corrected. How about your data? What do we do when something goes wrong? Now, the stakes on this might be trivial. If a sensor malfunctions and is showing you jumping instead of running, we might not worry. But if the sensor perhaps implies that you are doing something you might not want to be doing, if you're in a place that is problematic, or if in other ways puts you in vulnerable spots that you didn't consent to, what rights do the people who have their data being collected have to change it? And who is accountable for the accuracy of this data? So thinking about what this record shows and the fullness of what it can be used for, again, is something easier to think about at the architecture level, at the top, than in hindsight. And of course, we have security. So a few weeks ago, I was finishing a submission to UCLA's IRB for a research project that I'm doing. My project involved interviews, and the interviews were fairly sensitive. They were about CRISPR genome modification and attitudes about how people might want to use this technology. But I, like most people who conduct interviews, perform them using digital recording. And all of my data is, of course, digital. So I'm clicking through the IRB forms and all of the various sorts of requirements for the storage of this data. And the IRB forms say that the preferred form of secure storage is that I keep this data in a locked cabinet in my locked office, which is adorable. And then when there's a tiny little line about digital data, they say make sure you store it in a secure location. Okay. So when I asked, because I was curious, what a secure location looks like for our IRB, I got very little guidance. The reason for that, of course, is that our IRB, like your IRBs, like all IRBs, don't yet have the technical expertise to understand what data security looks like. So what that means is that for our purposes, if we're trying to do right by our subjects and patients, trusting the IRB to take care of that for us is not going to be sufficient. We are on our own. So now we have to think about, what does sufficient security genuinely look like? I'll tell you what it does not look like. It does not look like perfect, ironclad, can never be hacked security. The reason it doesn't look like that is because that looks like unicorn. It doesn't exist. So given that perfect is not achievable, what is the line of sufficient? What does it mean to have sufficient safeguards? Now, that's going to be a question of judgment. That judgment has to be intentional and deliberate, thinking about what does it mean to adequately protect the data in a meaningful way if IRBs and also legal protections aren't sophisticated enough to guide us. So thinking about security on our own as researchers is going to involve a whole lot of depending on your friendly computer scientists and making sure that they're fully integrated into the kinds of research projects that you intend to do. And this is also because when we think about our vulnerability and doing right by our subjects, we're also working with subjects who, just like IRBs, might not have sophisticated understanding of security themselves. And so simply asking, are you okay with us storing this on the cloud server? Which I gave this talk once, and I had a question. So there's not actually servers like elevated in the sky in the cloud? No, there's not. So asking how this works isn't enough. We have to think about how we're going to protect our subjects and patients in advance and what sufficient levels of protection look like. Which leads us to a topic that isn't often talked about, but should be. So one of the areas that, again, we can look back at the last 10 or 15 years of data tracking, and in particular with patients like sleep apnea cases or with all sorts of other sorts of medical tracking devices, is we start to see one theme emerging. And that's that mobile health tracking devices are not passively used just to collect data. They're also used to influence the relationship of care that patients get from their clinicians. So I was involved in a case recently in Southern California, a hospital I will not name, where there was a clinician who used a 72-hour continuous glucose monitor on her diabetic patient. So she's an endocrinologist, and one of the advantages of doing this, so a 72-hour continuous glucose monitor is a probe that's inserted under the skin. And now, instead of just getting spot readings of a patient's glucose whenever they check their blood glucose on a meter, I actually can get the entire peaks and valleys over a 72-hour neighborhood. Now, this is hugely advantageous for treatment, mostly because if I'm just seeing snapshots, I can't capture what's happening always before and after. And when I think about averages, I'm also often missing spikes. So this kind of technology was a huge advancement to helping really evaluate what kinds of diabetes and patterns the patients have. So the endocrinologist asked a woman to wear the 72-hour continuous glucose monitoring. The patient was very uncomfortable being monitored like this, didn't fully understand what was going to be monitored, and frankly felt that the clinician didn't trust her own data readings. Situation escalated. Now, it's hard to say now whether the clinician actually said, if you don't do this, I will no longer treat you, but I can tell you that that's what the patient heard. So what we have now is a question of whether or not this technology should be used as a gateway and a compliance monitor for not just questions about, are you participating in my study, but also questions about, should you have access to medical care? For sleep apnea devices, should you be allowed to maintain your truck driving license or your pilot's license, where all of that data is used to check for compliance before you're allowed your professional license? There are some proposals to start to tie continuous glucose monitoring, should it be available to driver's license. Now, questions about the fuller social implications around this data gathering is something that we don't want to be blindsided by. And to think about how this alters the relationship between researcher and patient and anyone who's beyond that is worth thinking about. So many companies today still legally can refuse to hire people who are nicotine. One of the reasons they do this is because, of course, it gets them lower group insurance rates. Now, traditionally, how they enforce this is that upon hire, a urine sample is taken to detect nicotine. If you start using nicotine, either again or for the first time after you've been hired, not much people can do at that point, unless you're wearing the appropriate sensor. And now we have the possibility of employment being tied into the kinds of devices that we've been thinking of in a very different way. So thinking about how this alters the larger social structure, about what we can do, and thinking about what our role is as there is non-trivial. The big one. So when we think about mHealth ethics, when we think about data tracking in general, the first thing people typically worry about is, of course, privacy. Now, we've heard about some of the sensitive data that can be collected, and one of the things that many of us worry about is, well, I value my privacy, and I don't want that kind of sensitive data collected or tracked about me. We think that there's something morally problematic with revealing people's most innermost behaviors, your drug use, your sex. If I track the way that your vision works, I can infer things about your sexual orientation. I can infer things about your religion and your most private desires. This is revealing. And this is also something enormously problematic and uncomfortable. So here's what I want to suggest. When we think about privacy, often that's where the conversation ends. Privacy is important. Thank you very much. But what we don't get to do is talk about what happens next. So it turns out that privacy is going to be an awful lot like security, data security, which is to say, perfect doesn't exist. The question that we have to ask ourselves is, what is sufficient? What does that mean? What is enough? What does it mean to fulfill our moral obligations to our subjects and to our patients? Well, I want to talk about ways to think about moving forward. So here are some preliminary ideas and approaches to think about as you work on your own research. So traditionally, what happens when people think about the devising of their experiences and their various sorts of interactions with either subjects or patients is we think about how to protect patient privacy. This is something actually that's going to be foundationally misleading. So the interesting thing about privacy is not what we call an intrinsic good. It's not a good that we think about being good in and of itself. In fact, for most of us, if we were truly private, if no one saw anything going on with us, we were in a bubble of invisibility, that would be a version of hell, right? This is not something that we should maximize. The interesting thing about privacy is it represents a different kind of good. Privacy represents something about our agency, about our control. It means instead that privacy, the value of this good, is directly related to me being able to control who gets access to my data. That's foundationally what's important about privacy. And what that means is that all sorts of us are going to have very different feelings about what levels of privacy are sufficient. Some of us try to go on reality shows. Some of us are not on Facebook, right? And to think about the wide variety of values around privacy in between shows you how different those standards can be. Instead of thinking about privacy as the end of the discussion, let's think of it as the beginning. Think about focusing instead on a robust consent approach, thinking about how to communicate through a genuinely good informed consent process. Now, features of high-quality consent process, we've heard some of them right before this talk, but here are some of the things that we should focus on. So the first is completely, as much as possible, plain language explanations. From top to bottom data collection and storage. This is a huge amount of translational work to make sure that the average person can understand the technical data that we're trying to communicate. But this also involves specifying precisely what the risk looks like, including the risk that we cannot get or see. If this data is going to be stored and mined for other things that we're not sure of at this moment, that has to be communicated, that uncertainty, to the subject. This also involves a discussion of data ownership, access, and profit, so that the subject knows exactly what he or she is agreeing to. But that's not enough. So often, when we talk about consent, we refer to medical models, as if the informed consent medical model is without controversy. So in my field, one of the areas I focus on is when the medical model fails horribly, right? When in the medical context, informed consent doesn't work. Here's one of the things that we see over and over again. Frequently, the people who we're monitoring, or in the medical situation, the people who we're providing care for, are not in a position to provide genuine informed consent. So if I'm working with vulnerable populations, if I'm working with people who are perhaps children, who perhaps have consent-impairing illnesses, who are involved in addiction, situations that make consent difficult, simply asking them to sign this form and read all this data, this isn't going to do it. We also have the problem of third parties. What happens when I'm now monitoring data for people who I didn't even get the cursory consent for? So I want to suggest a direction to think about this problem. So one of the things that we think about with big data, we're thinking about the huge quantities of data that's available in all kinds of other ways, even above and beyond mHealth. It's often there's been talks about thinking about a new role of a data curator, someone whose relationship to the data is to help pull useful things from the data and serve as an intermediary between huge data sets and people who want to use the data. I want to suggest that there's room, especially with mHealth data, for another intermediary role. You can call this the data guardian. This person is responsible to the subject and not to the research. Now, in the medical context, we often talk about consent as being either actual, the person signed these forms, Or hypothetical, the person was in a coma, but we think a reasonable person would have agreed to these interventions. But hypothetical consent gives us a model for how to think about when genuine consent is possible. How do we make that work? Well, we have a guardian. We have someone whose only job it is to represent and advocate for the subjects and the patient. Having this person involved in your project allows you to negotiate even when a negotiation in the actual circumstances isn't possible. There are a lot of other ways to handle increasing the quality of consent, but thinking about how to build this into your team and your architecture is one of the first steps. Lots more to say, but thank you.